Hey everybody, welcome to this edition of Bird Brain 66 with your hosts, Andy Teague over there. On which side, Andy? Are you on the right or the left tonight? We never know.
I don't know.
I'm Brian Bretsch, and we're excited for this episode to be joined by longtime TV and radio voice, Marc Strauss. Marc, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I've watched you guys before, and Brian and you and I have talked on the radio, and I'm excited to be here.
Well, we're excited to have you. So, Andy, like we always do, give us a quick overview of what Cardinal set we'll be reviewing tonight.
The 68 top set with 39 cards, with 41 if you include the two insert cards, which we will include because they're also pretty cool cards. I particularly like this set. I know, like we just discussed a little bit ago, some people don't like the set, but myself, I think it's really cool. 5 Cepeda cards within the set. That's one reason I really like it. And plus, it's got all the World Series cards and the players from the World Series from '67. So that's my quick take on that.
And Marc, you and I have talked about this for a long time. You have some real sentimental ties to the 1968 tops, not only just the Cardinal cards in general, but just, the entire set. Tell us a little bit about why that burlap look of 1968 really gets you fired up.
Yeah, it's my favorite set. It was the first year that I started collecting baseball cards. A friend of mine introduced me to baseball cards. I didn't even know they existed until 1968. That sounds weird, but my dad was more of a football fan than a baseball fan. So he liked baseball, but I discovered baseball cards in 1968. And of course, growing up in St. Louis, we moved to St. Louis in the summer of '67. So you're coming off the World Series and you go to the drugstore and you start collecting these packs. And there was some real gold in some of those packs. Upstairs, I've got one of the 2 Nolan Ryan rookie cards that I got out of those packs. But, when you're a Cardinal fan, and this is probably true no matter where you live, you never can get Cardinal cards in the pack.
Yes.
It's always Hal Lanier and Jerry Buchek and players like that. But I've got a lot of cards. And the other thing about the set that I really like, and you mentioned the burlap look, I call it, the border is, I guess you could call it the burlap look. A lot of people don't like that, but since it was the first year that I collected, I guess because I was introduced to cards with that particular style, it's always been my favorite. And I always liked the little colored circle that they had in each card with the team name and the position that the player played. They did that again the next year. I just thought that was really neat. It was also very random, the colors they used for each team. The Cardinals had a yellow circle, and the A's had a purple circle. And I don't know that there was any rhyme or reason as to why the Tops picked those colors for specific teams. It just seemed very random. But years later, it's almost Pavlovian. When you see a card with a certain color circle, you automatically know what team it is.
Right. Yep. Exactly. So, Andy, I'm going to ask you this question, and then I'll turn it back over to Marc because he brings up a topic that he said right at the top of what makes collecting fun is. Did you ever, when you and I were collecting and always go onto the 5 and dime, did you ever have that? And we called it the conspiracy theory, where, if you were buying packs of cards in the St. Louis area, it seemed like Tops typically, would not put Cardinals in the sets. So talk a little bit about, your frustration, when we were kids.
Well, the interesting part about that is Brian and I got a little enterprising, and we found a local vendor that we could ride our bikes to and actually buy an entire 36-pack box from. I think it was like $10 at the time. And we'd each have a box, and we'd go back and we open all these cards up, and it's like we couldn't even complete the Cardinal team set out of 2 boxes of cards. I'm like, how is that even possible? And you were lucky to even get maybe 10 Cardinals out of 2 boxes. So yeah, I think they did something with the distribution. They had to, because it just made no sense that you couldn't get all the players out of 2 boxes of cards.
Right.
I definitely think there's some kind of conspiracy there.
And Mark, one of the other things before I ask you about the conspiracy thing, when you opened up with buddies a pack, did you ever do this? Oh, have that, and then if your buddy opened something or you opened something that you didn't have, like the McCarver All-Star, you would say, need that. Did you ever do anything like that when you're tearing open packs with your buddies?
Yeah, well, we would do that. It was usually with my brother.
Okay.
And then you'd see who, for some reason, and I think we're all ashamed of this, we weren't that excited about doubles. It didn't matter who it was. You were alluding to the conspiracy theory. It seemed like the drugstore that I used to go to would always, I would always get the San Francisco Giants, and I would get all the Yankees but Mickey Mantle.
Right.
Now I have two Mantle cards from that year. I don't know how many I actually collected buying packs, but boy, I'll tell you what, if today was 1968 with the internet and social media, I could have traded. I had about 10 Willie Mays cards. I could have gotten all of those Cardinal cards from somebody out in San Francisco or Oakland in return for Willie Mays and Willie McCovey, because I have the whole Giants team here, and I'm still short on some Cardinal cards.
Isn't that crazy? And the same thing was probably happened to those folks in San Francisco, or they're like, why do I keep getting, John Edwards, Lou Brock, Larry Jaster, Roger Maris? I mean, I only have 10 of each of them. Why can't I get a freaking Willie Mays or a Willie McCovey card?
That's right. So, yeah, we would do that. I kept doubles for a while, but it was usually to trade them. And I wasn't that interested in them. But of course, years later, we all wish we would have had all the doubles and triples and quadruples of cards that we threw away.
So, Andy, going to this 68 set, and Mark, I'll ask you the same question. Tell us a little bit about, throw out a couple of guys that are your personal favorites. I mean, I already know that you're going to say Hooley and Orlando Cepeda. But in addition to those guys, and you can certainly show those cards. I'm not telling you not to, but who are some of your favorites in the set?
Well, now you put me on the spot, so now I don't want to show any of those cards. I'm just kidding.
Sorry.
Actually, speaking of that, I like the way they did the checklist cards then, because I like that. I like the player photo on the checklist card, and so to me, that's something I wish they would have always had done throughout the years, but. They did it a few times, but not often enough. So I really like that feature within the card set. I mean, you could grab anybody, Brock or Gibson or any of the players out of this particular set. But I will always defer back to red, because I always love a red Shandy's card. So there's one right there.
It's the World Series celebration.
Yeah, great photos on the World Series cards. I like the way they did that as well.
Mark, two questions to you. One is I'll let you show your favorite Cardinal here in just a second, or your favorite two, but I'm going to have you go back to when you were with your brother tearing open those packs. We ask this question every once in a while. Do you remember, I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be a Cardinal. When you opened up that first pack in 1968, do you remember that very first card? That it's ingrained in my head who my first card ever was. Do you have that same recollection?
I absolutely do, Brian. The first card that I ever pulled out of a pack, and I still have it, I have it upstairs on my dresser, was Ed Kranepool of the New York Mets, who was a 17-year-old rookie in 1962 when the Mets were formed, and actually got to I think he batted 6 times that year, spent his entire career with the Mets, retired, I think he was 34, which means he was a major leaguer for 17 years and retired at 34. And so, again, for sentimental reasons, and besides, if you take a look at that card, it's a beautiful card. Let me see if I can find it real quick. It's perfectly it's perfectly shot and everything else. I don't know, where is it? I've got another one here. I must have put it upstairs. Anyway, it's perfectly balanced. He's in his swing follow through. The colors are great. It's right by the batting cage at Shea Stadium. And I've always liked that card. And yes, I remember it as the first one I ever collected. So it's got kind of a special place.
Then do you remember your first Cardinal when you finally got one, probably after 12, 15 packs?
I don't really remember who the first Cardinal was because, you know, that's all a blur. That's all a blur. I really don't.
Yeah. No, that's okay. So the other thing I was going to talk about is, you know, some of my favorites obviously is Roger Maris. I'm not holding Roger Maris, but I always show this card as I'm covering up my face, so you can tell Mark that Andy and I are both professionals when we do these recordings. But this one always gets me is this guy right here, Mike Torres, and what, you know, how good the Cardinals could have been had they kept Mike. Another one that is another guy that got away, which I still don't understand. Bobby Tolan, just some of the moves that they made, and I know they won one World Series in '67, and they came back and, you know, should have won in '68, and then they made all kinds of wholesale changes after that. But my personal favorites out of all these, and I know we haven't talked about them yet, is I love these All-Star cards. I think, you know, saying that they're the Sporting News and
Oh yeah.
those are my personal favorites.
Yep.
Rock. Yep.
I think these All-Star cards are some of the nicest All-Star cards the Topps ever put out in that era, you know, the 60s and the 70s. And, you know, just the way they're balanced and the color of them. And they're just nice cards. They're, in some cases, they're nicer than the player's actual card. And on the back, they were a puzzle.
Right.
And there were two puzzles. One was Orlando Cepeda and one was Carl Yastrzemski, who were the two league MVPs
in '67.
In '67. So if you collected all of these, now there's a little piece of trivia about the puzzle of Orlando Cepeda. If you look closely, Orlando Cepeda is posing with Lou Brock's bat.
All righty. So I learned something. Andy, did you know that?
I did not know that. I never.
Well, all you have to do is turn the card over, and you can.
I never paid attention to that.
Yeah, and that's
Okay.
and the ironic part of that is, and maybe they were doing this on purpose, but if you notice, the part of the bat that shows Lou Brock's name,
Yep.
is the Lou Brock card.
Yep. Wow.
So they're playing games with you. They were playing games with you.
Mark, that was excellent trivia. I honestly.
Well, it's not exactly trivia. You can see it with your own eyes. I mean,
I know, but I mean, a good nugget of baseball knowledge that I did not know about. So that is awesome. So when I do that as a random card, I will give you props for that discovery and letting Andy and I know. So, Mark, one other quick question to you. So, you know, you said that you moved to the St. Louis area in '67, buy your first couple of packs or start collecting in '68. How much did baseball and listening to KMOX influence you in your, you know, wanting to go into broadcasting?
Oh, a lot. I think it wasn't until I moved to St. Louis that I really started to pay attention to sports. And my grandfather on my dad's side was a huge baseball fan. He had grown up in Boston and then later moved to New York. He hated the Yankees, so he'd never go to Yankee Stadium unless the Red Sox were in. Anyway, my grandfather was the one where when I'd visit my grandparents, where he'd be watching a baseball game. And at the time they lived in New Jersey and he was retired, but he wouldn't watch the Yankees, so he'd watch the Mets. I didn't know until I got a little bit older that he was actually a Red Sox fan, but that was an era where, hey, you couldn't hear or see the Red Sox play unless they were on the game of the week on Saturday. So he had to adopt a new team and follow his team, the Red Sox, through the newspapers, find out what they did the next day, or if they happen to give the score on the radio on the Mets game or on TV. He was the one that I would sit with while he was watching ball games, and I really started to learn about the game. And of course, you learn, hey, these games are on the radio. I can hear them. I can follow them. And absolutely, Jack Buck and Harry Carey are the reason that I got interested in broadcasting.
And tell Andy too, I don't know, I mean, we kind of talked about this before recording. So you went to, you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, was it Lindenwood? Where did you go to?
Lindenwood College at the
Okay.
time, now it's Lindenwood University.
Okay, that's what I thought you had said. So tell us a little bit about how that all comes into play. And then all of a sudden, here you are coming out of college. Maybe it's between your junior and senior year, whenever it is, when you have to do your internship. And how do you end up landing at KMOX? And then once that happens, you know, you get to meet Jack and you know, some of those broadcasting heroes of yours.
Yeah, you know, a lot of the people who worked at the college radio station at Lindenwood, KCLC, and they're still operating, we used to do about 80 local high school play-by-play events a year. We do high school basketball 3 times a week. We do high school football. We would do high school baseball and American Legion baseball in the summertime. And anybody who worked at the radio station, generally, depending on what your interests were, if you were in news, you wanted to work a news internship. If you were one of the disc jockeys at the station, you wanted to do an internship maybe at KSLQ or KSHE or one of those stations, and work with the music director and, you know, learn about categorizing and cataloging music and working with the promoters and all of those things. But in the case of the guys who were interested in sports, and there's a long list of people in broadcasting who interned at KMOX, a lot of them went on to become KMOX broadcasters. Dan McLaughlin, who's the TV voice of the Cardinals, was an intern at KMOX who went to Lindenwood. I think Tom Ackerman was an intern at KMOX, and on and on and on. There's a long list of people who came out of that sports department. So I had known some people who had interned at KMOX, and there wasn't any place else to intern. If you were interested in being a sports broadcaster, it was a no-brainer. It was absolutely, that's what you wanted to do, and you apply for it. And the manager of our student station, who was one of the faculty at Lindenwood, you know, contacts whoever his contact is over there. And, you know, I don't even remember what the process was. It was such a long time ago, but I was accepted into the internship program, and I went over there, and I actually worked the early part of the day and worked with Jim Holder and Gary Bender primarily. And a lot of people may remember Gary Bender, a wonderful man who at the time was one of the premier announcers for CBS television sports. He did the NBA, he did the NFL, and he was also the sports director at Channel 4. So he would be doing sports in the middle of the day at KMOX radio. You'd see him do sports at night. I mean, he was as busy as Jack Buck at the time. And a lot of people forget about that. He's out in Arizona now. And I worked with Jim Holder, who was the sports coordinator over there. A lot of people remember Jim, who was later he had been at KSDK radio or KSD radio. And Jim is responsible for the organization, the ability to organize and plan that I have. And I know a lot of other former KMOX interns who owe a lot to him, because you really learned how to be able to manage lining up guests. Funny story about Jim Holder, if we have time, if I can tell it.
Sure.
Jim, after you got to know him, he's a great guy, but he'd always test you at the beginning of your internship. And I remember one of those first tests, Jim had a Rolodex. Remember the old Rolodex with the cards? It was round and you'd go through it. And they were set up to keep your information in alphabetical order. Only Jim did not care about alphabetical order. And so he would jot down somebody's contact information. Back then it was just a phone number, and put it in the Rolodex. You know, the cards had a little slice out of each hole, and you just stick them in there. One of the first days I was there, and I'm a little nervous. This is KMOX, okay? And I think you guys understand, especially at that time, they were it. There were no other stations that even gave 10 minutes to sports. KMOX was the king. So you knew when you were there that you better not embarrass anybody. You better get the job done. And Jim was very serious. And he says to me, Jack's coming in. He needs to record an interview with Tony Dorsett. I'm going to need you to call him and get that recorder set up and recorded that interview with him. Back then, we did everything on the phone. So I said, okay, where would I get a phone number for Tony Dorsett? He says, it's in the Rolodex. That's it. That's all he said. And I go to the Rolodex and I notice that none of it's in alphabetical order. It's all at random. And Jim had been there for, I don't even know how many years at that point. It was probably going on 10. So you got 10 years worth of phone numbers in that Rolodex, and his aren't the only ones that are in there. So like this notebook full of cards, Tony Dorsett's number could be anywhere. And I found it. I was a little nervous, but I found it. Just in time for Jack Buck to come walking in the door, me to dial the phone and get that recorder started. So it looked like I knew what I was doing, but I was scared to death. But after that, that was Jim's way of testing me to see if I could get something done without a lot of breadcrumbs. And I did it. So after that, he trusted me and let me do whatever I needed to do.
So Andy, I'll ask you this question too, and then we'll go back, and then we may have to take a editing break here in just a couple of seconds to add more time, Mark. So if the screen disappears, then we'll come back and we'll edit it all together. But so Andy, we've talked about a lot of different things. So how many times as a young kid did you have the transistor radio, near your head when your parents told you it was time to go to bed and you wanted to listen to the Cardinal game? So you've
every night that they were on, basically, because I think with our generation that people forget about the lack of internet and all that it means to get ball games that you can get now. That was the transistor radio was about the only way you could get it. And my dad always had KMOX on no matter what time of day it was. So got the news in the morning and sports at night or whatever was going on. So it was always on in the car or on at home. So, and then had it in the room too, so you could listen to the games. And I remember one specific time when Force threw that second no-hitter. I was actually grounded that night, and the only thing I had to listen to, and I got to listen to Force throw the no-hitter. So I can go back to that date, and I remember I was grounded on that date.
It's probably something I did to get you in trouble, most likely.
It's probably true. Yeah.
Right. So the other thing, and Mark, I'll ask you about this because sports on a Sunday morning was, like Andy would said, we had KMOX on a lot. My dad was more of a football guy than he was a baseball guy, but my mom was more of a baseball fan than she was. So it balanced it out really well in the house. But sports on a Sunday morning was just, that was on. Somebody got up at 6 a.m. on a Sunday, you'd get ready, you'd listen, go to church, you listen to it all the way into before you got out of the car. And as soon as you got back in, sometimes if it was like a big baseball day on a Sunday, they were playing the Cubs, or if it was football, if they were playing the Washington back then Redskins and Cowboys or whatever, you always had to have sports on a Sunday morning on with, Jim Holder and then eventually Ron Jacober and, all the others. So Mark, tell us, continue your story about, when you would, as an intern, you'd have to go through and mark the highlights. You were talking about tearing that piece of paper off for like a Ken Oberkfell base hit or a home run. Finish what you were telling us about there.
Well, I did have an indirect way of helping to build the Sports on a Sunday show, because all throughout the week, every night there was a sporting event on KMOX. And so just imagine these huge reel-to-reel tape recorders. The biggest ones that they made at the time. And these reels, they were almost like the tires that you carry in the back of your car as a spare. Literally, they were that big because they could run for an hour or an hour and a half. And so as those things were recording the ball game that was on KMOX at the time, your job as an intern would be to mark the highlights. And in that era, which was obviously so different than the digital era that we live in now, you would just tear off a little piece of paper. And as that reel-to-reel was going around, let's say Ken Oberkfell hit a home run or whoever, and you slip that little piece of paper in there in between the tape, and it would hold it. And then when those games were over at some point during the week, you would go back through that game and fly through it, get to that first piece of little marker, and then you would transfer a recording from the reel to reel onto a cart of the highlight, and then you would label the cart with a little sticky label that might say Ken Oberkfell home run, 5th inning, and the date. And then all of the highlights from that game, you'd stack up, you put them in a spot, and whoever was presenting the highlights, whoever the host was at the time, whether it was Jim Holder or whether it was later Ron Jacober, although Ron was still on TV when I was an intern, whoever was doing sports on a Sunday, they would put those highlights together, make some notes, and then they would present them. And there were a lot of them. It was a big job. It was a long job. It wasn't like now where you can just fast forward on a computer screen and go exactly to 10 minutes and 15 seconds. And there's the start of the highlight. And you could just pull that out of there. And it was a laborious type of operation that they did for every week's show. And, that was done also with the idea that when the morning sports came up the next day, whoever was anchoring the morning sports would have some menu of highlights that they could go through to spice up the sportscast. So that was my little way, since I didn't work on Sunday or work helping produce the show. That was one of the things that I did. And then there was an engineer there by the name of Frank Polanco, who seemed to sort of, I don't know if he was sort of assigned to look after all of these reels, just reels and reels of these broadcasts. It usually took 2 or 3 reels for a ball game. And I don't know where they stored them or how they stored them, but these tapes were all over the place. And at some point, I know they digitized a lot of them. And that must have been an unbelievable job, because you're talking about decades worth of audio tape that they had to go through in order to catalog everything that they had in that station's history.
So I'll ask this question to you, Mark, and then I'll, because I know Andy's got a couple of these stories that he and I just share all the time. Sometimes we do it when we're doing a recording like this. But so first to you, Mark. So who was the first athlete who walked through KMOX maybe to do an in-studio interview that you recognized and said, "Oh my gosh, it's Tony Dorsett, or it's Fake McBride, or whoever"?
Well, it wasn't a baseball player. It wasn't a ball player. It was actually, and he was very, very big at the time, and I know you guys are familiar with him, Craig Virgin.
Okay.
The runner Craig Virgin, who had been, as a younger man, the Illinois State cross country champion
From Lebanon, Illinois.
That's right, and who later became a national and international champion. And he was one of the people at KMOX, because Mr. Highland used to do this. He wanted any athlete who had a high profile to have a relationship with KMOX. And Craig Virgin at the time did maybe not a weekly, but maybe a bi-weekly appearance. And he would do a sit down. Sometimes it was with Gary Bender. Sometimes it was with somebody else. Sometimes he'd be on Sports Open Line. But he's the first guy that I met. And I've kind of stayed in touch with him through the years. And actually, about 2 years ago, one of the guys who used to write for the Panagraph, named Randy Scher — the Panagraph is the local newspaper in Bloomington, Illinois — he wrote a book with Craig Virgin, because Craig dealt with some really debilitating injuries. And he did a book with Craig, and I actually had him on the radio a couple of times. He's a really fascinating guy who's highly motivated. And that's the first athlete who I met, who came in, and he was doing an interview with Gary Bender that was going to be recorded for Sunday morning. And boy, he's a very gracious guy and was really nice to me. And I remember him still being very enthusiastic. And actually, when I was in TV, he made a couple of trips up to Peoria, because the state cross country meet is here in Peoria at Detweiler Park. And so his being attached to the state cross country meet through being a past champion and helping to advocate and promote the event every so often brought him into town, and he was a guest and got to kind of reunite with him there as well.
So Andy, that's a great first, superstar or athlete, to cross paths with. Andy, what about you? I mean, for all this stuff, I mean, again, I just know how much your dad and your grandfather love sports. You always have good stories. Do you recall, the very first, doesn't have to be, the Cardinal baseball player, could have been a football Cardinal, it could have been like Mark with an outstanding cross-country track runner and Craig Virgin. Who was the first person that you recall meeting and maybe being starstruck, or just you were amazed that you recognized who they were?
It was actually two people, and neither one of them were athletes. We took a family vacation to Las Vegas in 1977, and my dad liked to play blackjack. And the first one was Gabe Kapler. And, I knew him from obviously Welcome Back, Kotter. So it was like, oh my gosh, my dad's playing blackjack with, Gabe Kapler. And I'm like, to me, he's playing blackjack with Mr. Kotter. So talked to him, because he came over. He actually said, my son likes watching the show, and he came over and talked to me. And the other one was on the exact same trip. It was Kojak, Telly Savalas. He was in MGM Grand, and he was playing blackjack as well. It was like, I don't know, it was probably like 10 o'clock in the morning. He was there playing blackjack, and he came over and said hi too. So those were my first two. So they weren't even athletes. They were two TV stars. So those I can remember those two things like it was yesterday. Being there with my dad and the two of them coming up. So it was pretty cool. So, but otherwise, in person, I think it was other than run up and get an autograph or something. I think I was with you. We were at Six Flags, and we saw Tito Landrum at Six Flags.
Yeah.
And so that was probably the first one where you actually just kind of, casual, walking about or whatever, we ran into him. It was one of the Cardinal off days that we were actually over at Six Flags. So athlete wise, it was Tito Landrum.
Yeah, I remember that. Mine, I think, was Dan Deerdorf, a football player. So that was kind of a chance meeting, but still remember that. And of course, I was with my dad being the big football player. But just kind of transitioning back, guys, to get ready to start wrapping up.
Brian, I got to take an alibi on that. Now you said Deerdorf. Now you just jogged my memory. It was actually, I was with you and your dad, and we went to Scott Air Force Base, and they had a celebrity basketball game. So there was Jim Hart, Red Shandies, Robin Smith, Tim Van Gelder,
probably Terry Metcalf.
Yeah, and Kreider to play for the Patriots, and I can't remember who else was on there, but I still have the admission card. It was $2 to get in there, and they all signed the back of the card, every one of them. So that's my alibi. So it was actually that whole group of people.
Yeah, that was fun.
Just to let everybody know, Red Shandies was not playing basketball.
Yeah, they used to do that a lot, Mark. They would have these celebrity basketball games, and they would sometimes play at Scott Air Force Base. They played a couple of times at, I believe, Belleville East when it first opened up. So really cool. But we'll get back here, kind of reining ourselves back in and talk about the 68 burlap. I just like saying that. I don't know where I came up where it looks like burlap, and maybe I'm showing my age. But Mark, in closing for you, looking at some of yours, any in particular one, again, going back that we may not have talked about from either, just, it doesn't even have to be a Cardinal card, any other ones that just in that set that's near and dear to your heart?
I've got a couple of Cardinal cards I was already planning to talk about, if you don't mind.
Sure.
And you guys haven't mentioned them. And I'm going to apologize if I'm redundant here. I know that Andy talked about Julian Javier, and I have a little story about Julian Javier and the hat that he's wearing in this picture. Julian Javier, of course, was a member of the Cardinals World Series teams in 1964, 1967, and 1968. And as you gentlemen know, because you're card collectors, in the 1960s, we have no idea what year these pictures were actually taken. There's a shot that's used by Topps of Willie Mays that shows up in 3 different sets. And just to prove what I'm talking about, by 1968, the Cardinals didn't wear the blue caps anymore. And Dick Hughes is clearly wearing a blue cap in the 1968 card. And I think the last year they wore the blue caps, if I'm not mistaken, was 1964 or 65. So I don't know that this is the cap that I'm going to talk about. But if you've ever seen the World Series film for the 1967 World Series, when the Cardinals win the final game of the 1967 World Series, and they all go and crowd around Bob Gibson and start to celebrate, there's an umpire by the name of Augie Donatelli, who I think spent 23 years as an umpire in the major leagues, who comes over and grabs Javier's cap and one of his teammates' caps. And you can clearly see him take it off Javier's head, and Javier turn around with a smile on his face and acknowledge Donatelli, didn't have any problem with it. Years later, many years later, after Donatelli had retired and Javier had been out of baseball for 20 or 30 years, Javier was in the St. Petersburg, Tampa, Naples area of Florida, where Augie Donatelli just happened to have a bar and grill. And he walks in, and they were friends. You know, that league was smaller. In 1967, there were only 10 teams in each league. Everybody knew each other. And he went into Donatelli's establishment, and he hadn't seen him for years, maybe not since the World Series. And he says, "Is Donatelli here?" And he was. And he comes out, and they make eye contact. And he says, "Where's my hat?" And Donatelli goes, "It's right there over the bar." And the hat, and maybe it's this one that Julian Javier is wearing in this 1968 card, was, I don't know that it's still there. Donatelli passed away a long time ago. Juli's still alive, as far as I know. That hat was in Donatelli's restaurant all those years. Isn't that a great story?
That's
That's
awesome.
awesome.
As far as my favorite cards from the set, I can't say that I have a favorite. My favorite Cardinal card, because I was a kid, and remember, I moved to St. Louis from New Jersey. And upstairs, I have a little Maris and Mantle home run twins M&M boys cap that my mother got me when I was a toddler. And I still have that piece of memorabilia. So when Roger Maris was traded to the Cardinals, wow, that was really something. This is Roger Maris's last baseball card, 1968. Yep, it's one of my favorite cards for a lot of reasons. Also because Roger Maris looked damn good in a Cardinal uniform.
Yes, he did.
Don't you think?
Absolutely.
I mean, who doesn't?
Right.
But this guy, coming from the Yankees with what he had done, and I've got a couple of these, and I've always cherished this card because it's his last.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's Roger Maris, for crying out loud. There's another card that I like in this set because it's probably the best year. It is the best year of this guy's career. And he's an unheralded Cardinal from 1968. And you guys, maybe you're a little younger than me, but Ray Washburn. 1968 was the best year of Ray Washburn's career. I think he went 14-8 that year, and his ERA was 2.26. So he was overshadowed, of course, by Bob Gibson in 1968. The other thing about the Ray Washburn card from this year is 1968 was the year that Ray Washburn on September 18th pitched a no-hitter against the San Francisco. And I remember this vividly, by the way. He no-hit the Giants 2-0. It was a getaway game. And it put the Cardinals up, I think, 12 games. They were running away with the pennant that year, September 18th. So the regular season was almost over. And this was the last year before divisional play, last year without playoffs. You won the league, you went right to the World Series. Well, the significance of Ray Washburn's no-hitter on September 18th, an afternoon getaway game in San Francisco at Candlestick Park, is that the night before, Gaylord Perry had no hit Bob Gibson and the Cardinals 1-0. It's the only time in the history of Major League Baseball that you had back-to-back no hitters on back-to-back days in the same series, with each team registering a no hitter. And so this card for me is kind of a special one because it was the back end of a very historic period for the Cardinals as they were rolling towards a pennant in a very dominant season. And Ray Washburn would never be as good again. And he made his final appearance as a major leaguer with the Cincinnati Reds in the 1970 World Series. The last game he pitched in relief. I think he was the last Reds pitcher in that game. And he retired at he wasn't that old. He was in his early 30s, but he had a great year in 1968 when he went 14-8 and had an ERA under 2.5.
Very cool. No, those are great stories. Some of them I've heard. Obviously, I'd never heard of the one with the Brock on the bat with Cepeda for the puzzle. So Andy, anybody else in there jumping out at you that I've got one, but
let me just show you one more.
Yep.
We know who that is.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that LaRussa had a card that year. That's Tony LaRussa with the Oakland A's. The first year of the Oakland A's, they had just moved from Kansas City. And it's really interesting that they gave him a card that year because he had not appeared in the major leagues since 1963. Now it's 1968. He'd bounced around the minors. He was a middling infielder, and he had only had 44 major league at-bats in that 1 year where he only played a part of a season with Kansas City. So it's kind of they must have not had enough players on the A's that they thought were worthy of cards. And somebody in the plant said, hey, we need one more guy to fill up this A's part of the set. Any guys, any ideas? And they must have come up with LaRussa. But, years later, he's in the Hall of Fame as a manager.
Right. And Andy, we know that about the 71 Top Series with Mike Shannon being a high number card, so that's.
Yeah, because he didn't even, it wasn't even playing then. Yeah, it's very interesting. There's probably my other one.
Yeah.
Really like.
From the league leaders.
Yeah.
Yeah, my last one, and then I just like this guy a lot too. I don't think he ever really got, any notoriety for him, but I think in the 1966 season, he pretty much owned the Dodgers. I mean, the Dodgers couldn't do anything against Larry Jaster. He was just amazing. But one other thing, though, before we get ready to close up.
Go ahead and put Shannon up there since you mentioned him. So we'll go ahead and throw it.
So, Mark, you're talking about the Dick Hughes card. You guys will all know when I do this side pose like this. How many Richie Allen cards do you guys have where he's in the Philadelphia Phillies uniform with the red cap on, and he's like with 3 different teams on 3 different seasons, and it's the same card. And Andy and I have talked about this on other shows, Mark. It's like, if you're from Topps, how in the world do you not have another flipping photo of Richie Allen or Dick Allen or Rich Allen? I've seen him called all three first names over the years on his card, but that one is my all-time favorite because he's the Phillies, the Cardinals, and then I think the last time they use it is when he's with the Chicago White Sox, and it's the same pose every single year on that. So.
Well, we talked about this before with the Willie Mays card that I was talking about, where you'll see the same picture, I think 3 times with him. Of course, he didn't change teams at that point. He was still with the Giants. I do know that Topps in those days, first of all, they were trying to save money. So the fewer times that they could photograph a guy, the less they had to pay him. And they didn't get that much back then. Really, it was a couple of $100 at the most. But I think what I was told by somebody who was a collector and seemed to know what they were talking about was Topps would always take 3 pictures of a player. They would take a picture of a player in an action shot or some sort of pose. The pitchers sometimes are always in their follow through. Right. Then they would take one with their cap on, and then they would take a third either with their cap off or with their cap tilted up. So all you saw was the underside of the bill, and it could be used for anybody. Go back to the LaRussa card. And of course, he was still with the A's, but they hadn't been wearing the green and gold yet. And you can clearly see that's an older version of the Kansas City A's uniform. So they would always take 3 shots, and one which could be termed generic that they could use on any occasion. I actually prefer that to what they started doing later when they would airbrush the logo out of the cap.
Yep.
I never liked that. I thought it looked cheesy. Some years it was actually horrible. It was almost like they put it on the desk of a 10-year-old in an art class and asked them to do it. So I actually prefer this
Right.
to those.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, we pointed that out on several occasions and several.
Yeah.
And what's your terminology that you coined that we always use now?
Well, yeah, dirty hats. Because when I first saw that as a kid, I thought, why do they have these dirty ball caps on? You know, but it's actually just poor paint job back in the day. Not even airbrushing. That was before airbrushing.
One of the interesting things about the 68 Cardinals in the set is that not all of them, but the majority of the shots are clearly at spring training in St. Petersburg at old Al Lang Field. There are a few shots of Cardinals. I think Bob Gibson's card and Steve Carlton's card were taken at Shea Stadium because a lot of the shots that Topps did were in New York. Sometimes you get one in Chicago. There were a few that were in Cleveland, but most of them were in New York. And I don't know if it was a case where they maybe couldn't come across Gibson and Carlton at Al Lang Field because they were pitchers and they just used one from a previous year. But the other thing about the Cardinals in that year my original point was, whoever the photographer was, I think that person, with the way they visualized what the card shot should look like, was superior to a lot of the other teams' sets. In other words, whoever they assigned the Cardinals to that year, they did a hell of a job.
Yeah.
Because these are nice looking poses. Lou Brock's card is a great. I mean, there's a guy. If you look at Lou Brock's card from 1968,
look at how happy he is.
He is clearly enjoying what he does for a living.
Yep.
I mean,
Yep.
you know, and that's a really neat card. They're balanced, and I just think, you know, not all of it, the photographers, you know, the guy who went to see the I don't know, the Twins or whoever. If you look at some of these teams, clearly the photographer who was shooting the Cardinals for this set was a lot better at it than some of his colleagues were.
Definitely. Well, Mark, we appreciate you being on as a guest. We'd love to have you come back on again in the future. That's the bad part about doing a show with us. If we think that you're good, we ask you to come back. So on that note, Andy, I'll let you get ready to close, and then we'll say goodbye to everybody.
Yeah, I want to thank Mark once again, and check us out at Bird Brains at everything. Bird Brains at YouTube, Twitter, Facebook. And is there anything else, Brian, that I'm forgetting? Because you are the social media magnet there. So
yes, we are on Twitter, our handle BirdBrain66, Facebook BirdBrain66, and of course our YouTube channel, which we're on right now, BirdBrain66. So subscribe and follow. And we say this all the time. We are growing, and thank Mark for being here. We're getting lots of former players, current players joining in on our conversations on Twitter. So it's a lot of fun. So Mark, any closing thoughts before we leave?
Well, the next time you have me on, I'll tell my Bob Force story that I alluded to in a tag of one of your card of the days.
Definitely. We'll do that soon. All right, everybody. Thanks for joining. Appreciate it.
thank you. Peace out.